Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Tom Temin here on Federal News Network. After 33 years of working for the National Treasury Employees Union, its president, Tony Reardon, is calling it a career. He'll retire in August when his term as president concludes. He joins me now in studio. Tony, good to have you in.
Tom, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
And golly, 33 years. Let's begin at the top here and let's talk about IRS itself. Kind of, I think of that as the central agency for NTEU, even though you're actually at 34 different agencies
Correct.
and components. But how do you think things have actually changed for the average IRS member in that third of a century?
Well, I think certainly things have gotten much more difficult for IRS employees, and I would attribute that to a number of things, Tom. I think first of all, you had all the funding issues that the IRS had, really dating back to 2010, if not even a little bit earlier than that. And so as a result, the IRS lost just tens of thousands of employees, and that certainly created a very tough environment for employees. But you know, when you think back to about 2013, as I recall, the IRS had to curtail a lot of training that they did for employees. And so, you know, my concern for employees has been that since the IRS doesn't have the funding, doesn't have the staffing, doesn't have the training for folks, that it really has created an environment where employees are not set up for success the way that they should be. Now, what I'm hopeful of, certainly given the $80 billion that the Inflation Reduction Act is bringing to the IRS, and now with a new commissioner, with Danny Werfel, I am hopeful that we're going to really start to see a change in all that.
It seems like the IRS is always the crucible for differences of politics that really are not of the agency's doing, because Republicans, Democrats have long-standing differences over tax policy, over tax enforcement, and they use the IRS as kind of the proving ground for those arguments, whereas the IRS is simply a functionary agency that carries out whatever the policy and the statutes are that it's presented with.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of average American doesn't always know that, look, it's Congress that puts all the tax laws in place. And the IRS is simply responsible for administering those tax policies, tax laws. And you know, one of the things that I tell people all the time, and I have for many years, because I think most Americans don't think about this as well. The IRS literally brings in 95 to 96% of our government's revenue. So they happen to be a very important piece of our nation's economy. And you know, I think when people start to hear some of the real story behind what the IRS delivers and what they're responsible for and how they get to be responsible for it, I think that really kind of changes often the viewpoint.
And getting back to the issue of the reduction in staff that kind of took a step function those years ago, also 30 some years ago, most of the processing, all of the processing for tax forms, tax returns was paper. Remember those desks that were surrounded by an array of trays for paper sorting, all this manual paperwork. That largely has gone away, I think, starting in around the late 90s with the advent of online payment. That was during the Clinton administration. So does it need the numbers that it had traditionally, given all of the automation that's come in and the technology?
Well, certainly we are in, the IRS is in desperate need of more employees. There is no question about that. And there are so many reasons why. I mean, number one, if you just think in terms of in call centers, you know, where they are required to answer phone calls from Americans. I mean, the level of service that the IRS had in responding to calls up until recent times was in the low teens and even below that. Well, the American people, the American taxpayer, have a much higher expectation of getting their phone calls answered, right? So there's certainly need of customer service, contact reps to be able to respond to phone calls. But also just in terms of folks who are responsible for helping the average American that needs to go into a tax center to get questions answered. Many of those offices were closed because they didn't have the staffing. And it's really our most vulnerable Americans that end up being negatively impacted because not all of them have computers. They don't all understand how to to work the various tax programs that are out there. They need to go in and simply be able to talk to somebody. And so there's a wide reason. IT, there is certainly a need for IT folks. I mean, I think we all know, or most people know, that the IRS is using computer systems that are older than I am, and I'm old. so I mean, there has to be some work done in staffing across the agency, technology across the agency, training across the agency, and so much more.
We're speaking with Tony Reardon. He is the president of the National Treasury Employees Union, and he's going to retire in August, and we have him in the studio. And that whole modernizing question, that has been kind of a morale killer, and it's really chewed up through a lot of personnel, both at the executive level and at the regular employee level, because they've made so many runs since, I guess, around 92 is when the first modernization was kind of launched for IRS. And the systems were getting old then, and now we're 30 years past that, more than 30 years, and yet the same master file system is still running in the same original code. And I mean, from your standpoint, why has it been such an intractable thing that they've spent billions and restarted that project probably a half a dozen times?
Yeah, I certainly don't have an inside track on exactly what's happened in IRS leadership or management that has resulted in this. What I can tell you is that frontline employees are the ones who have ultimately really paid the price, and I might add, the American taxpayer. So one of the things that I'm really hopeful of, and I've had many conversations with current Commissioner Danny Werfel. He is a guy that I think understands running a very large operation. And so I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to garner all of the resources necessary to be able to start to turn that. And I think he has a very strong understanding about what needs to happen in the IT arena to start to turn that around, because ultimately the idea has to be that employees have the tools and the resources that they need to do the job. Because one of the things that I can tell you as the national president of NTEU is when I talk to IRS employees, and I have for over 30 years, the number one thing that they want to do, they want to effectively serve the American taxpayer to a person. And so I think it's really important that the IRS provide the tools and the training and resources that employees need so they can do that.
I guess one thing that is working in their favor, the average employee's favor, is that conditions and attitudes toward the IRS are very different than they were in the era before that reorganization under Charles Rosati. And this followed, and I hate to say it, but the jackbooted thug perception era. So in that sense, there has been progress.
Well, yeah, I think there has been, but the other thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is for me, I guess what I would describe as a really sort of sad part of our history around the IRS. I mean, we've all heard, whether it's on the floor of Congress, in the media, but some folks talking about, for example, the 87,000 armed agents that are going to come and get you. I mean, and it's all lies. That is in no way, shape, or form what is happening. Just in terms of the 87,000, I mean, 52 to 56,000 of those are people who they're going to be replacing folks who are retiring or leaving the agency. And one of the things that I think is important for the average American taxpayer to know, at the IRS, there is something on the order of 2,000 to 2,500 folks who carry a weapon, and they're not even a part of the regular IRS. They're agents and they're law enforcement types. And, so this whole notion of 87,000 armed agents is a fabrication that is, I think, really meant to move forward some kind of a political agenda, and it's just not accurate.
My guest is Tony Reardon, President of the National Treasury Employees Union. We are up against the clock. Can you stick with me for another segment?
Absolutely.
We'll be back right after this short break.